Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Dear watcher, dear subscriber, dear students, dear teachers, dear parents, hope you will be fine and in the high state of iman and health. Myself, motivational speaker, leadership business coach, master trainer, language trainer, novelist, Professor MA Raza. Today, I'll try my best to fetch your live chat, but it depends on the particular. Just clear the. Okay. So, my dear fellows, my dear students, and my dear viewers, my dear watchers, we were on chapter 5. We are going to disclose it for today. And book 1, chapter analysis, book 1, chapter 5, summary. The scene shifted to Broxton parsonage, home of the Reverend Mr. Irwin, the local Church of England clergyman. The rector is playing chess with his mother. Joshua ran the Hayslope. Parish clerk arrives. He tells Mr. Irwin that the Methodists, especially Dinah, are causing religious dissensions in the town. At this point, Sir Donny Thorne, the grandson. Let me check the volume again. I hope so. It increased right now. Let's see. Okay. At this point, Arthur Donny Thorne, the grandson and heir of local square or landowner, comes in. He is pleasant, outgoing young man, a captain in the militia. Joshua tells the two men of this Bede's death and then goes into the kitchen. There is some talk of Thea's funerals and of Adam, and Arthur suggests that he and Mr. Irwin's ride to Hall Farm and then to Bede's Mr. Irwin, who is Arthur's godmother, talk about the celebration planned for his 21st birthday. Mr. Irwin goes upstairs to visit his two spinster sisters, one of whom is an invalid. Then the two men set out of Hall Farms so that Mr. Irwin may speak with the Dinah. Commentary. Having established that, before going to the commentary, there are three more important points. Number one, there is a funeral on the same place. There is a birthday party on the same place. There is a collision in between two different aspects of the incidents or incident and a accident. Okay, so commentary. Having established that her book is to focus on the common people, Eliot introduces the gentry. Arthur, local representative of aristocracy, serves as the agent of provoking the novel's crisis, while Mr. Irwin with Dinah is the focal point for the development of its moral message. The introduction of the gentry creates the need for some background information. The reader should try to understand the relationship which existed between the country aristocracy and the lower classes around 1800. In the first place, Squires Donny Thorne's, Arthur's grandfather, is literally the local landowner. His estate includes the land on which the town of Hayslope and its surroundings farms are built, and most of the other characters in the novel are tenants holding leases on his property. This economic This economic arrangements coupled with the traditional reverences of the common people for the aristocracy accounts for the great respect with which the lower class people in the novel treat Arthur. Higher to the estate, this great social distinction will become very important later on. Mr. Irwin is an attractive figure. He does not take his religious as seriously as Dinah take her. He is not very hardworking or ambitious. Very hardworking or ambitious, Eli tells us, and he is not very interested in teaching his parishioners the niceties of dogma, but he has charity, and this for Eliot is the important consideration. Mr. Irwin shares with Dinah a sincere love for humanity. They do not express there. That is another point you should underline it, that there is also a aspect of uh, love for God, humanity. They do not express themselves in the same way, but each applies principles in daily life. With Dinah does out of a love for God, the rector does out of a generalized benevolence. This humanitarian attitude is significant in several ways. For the moment, it will suffice to not to note that it is the attitude which Adam will eventually come to. His pride sometimes prevent him from reacting sympathetically towards others. Mr. Irwin then is in general an easygoing, sophisticated, comfortable man on who more by instinct than by training strives to behave like a Christian in any given situations. The picture we get of Arthur is much more ambiguous. He is obviously a charming fellow, very casual, very affable, and very popular for his good nature among those who know him. But as the novel progresses, we also learn that Arthur is vain and dangerously overconfident. He is not aware of his own faults and thus can take no steps to compensate for them. The negative aspects of Arthur's personality come to the fore only subtle in this chapter, but subtly in this chapter. But Eliot does give the young man some some dialogues which indicates certain shallowness. He refers, for example, to his upcoming 21st birthday as the grand apple of my majority, and complains lazily of being bored in the country. The reader should note that Adam and Arthur were boyhood friends, and the author still has a very high opinion of humble carpenter. The fact that these two young men have respects for each other intensifies the drama of the novel. Drama of the novel, the sequence of the novel. Drama here should be like a verb or of the verb. You can say classification, or if we say the clear sequences, or the clear plot construction of the novels. Crisis, as we shall see presently, the linking also serves to emphasizes the fact that Arthur and Adam share some basic characteristics. Arthur's confidence in his virtues is matched by Adam's confidence in his ability to solve all problems and control the course of his own life. Eliot dilates upon the existence of the two insignificant sisters, Kate Kate and Anne Irwin, her comments here form part of the fabric of humanitarian gospels Eliot is preaching to her. No human gospels from Bible. No human life is insignificant for the reason that every human being can be source of love and comfort for his fellows. Note in this context how the rector treats his sisters. However, that is another point, that how the rector treats his sister. That's a very brilliant brilliant we can say criticizing. However, according to Eliot, insignificant people can also stir up evil tempers, affects the price of bread, and in the case of the Irwin sisters, cause their brothers to remain a bachelor. In Eliot's words, they play no small part in the tragedy of life. She points out that such people can be as effective in their own in occurrent innocuous way as the moral colorful people she write about, and should not be underestimated or dismissed. In this chapter, the author employs at great length a literary method which has appeared once before toward the end of chapter 3. She breaks off her story. She breaks off her story she breaks off her story line to comment in her own voice on issues which her descriptions of the thoughts and actions of her characters have raised. This sort of direct this sort of direct authorial comments, sometimes referred to as the dear reader techniques, is no longer in wide using, since it interrupts the plot and destroys the illusions of reality which the novel as a whole should create. But it is one of Eliot's favorite device on of one of the primary ways in which she communicates her meaning to the reader and controls his reactions to her characters and the situation she places them in. Chapter analysis, book 1, chapter number 6 to 9. Now we are going to read it right now, and that's a very important part of the this particular. Let me one. No, that is I discussed. I've got a question, and I discussed it in chapter number 1. So you should listen after this. After listening this lecture, you must listen part 1. That will definitely help you in this case. The question was basically from chapter number 1, so I didn't decided to. So now decided to entertain that in this particular sequence. Now, chapter analysis, book 1, chapter 6 to 9 summary. For the most part, chapter 6 describes a daily life at the Hall farm. The house itself is an old manor converted into a farmhouse in which Mr. and Mrs. Poyser, their 3 children, Mr. Poyser's niece, Hattie Sorrel, and a couple of domestic servants live. It is the best run from the run farm on the estate. Mr. Poyser is a very good farmer, and Mrs. Poyser an excellent housewife and dairy manager. The scene is busy as Arthur and the rector ride towards the farm. There is a conference going on in the barn, and Mrs. Poyser is indulging in her favorite occupation, scolding one of the maids. Mrs. Poyser's 3-year-old daughter, Toti, her mother's adored favorite her mother adores favorite is playing, and Dinah, who is Mrs. Poyser's niece, is mending the household linen. Mrs. Poyser indicate that Zhao she loves, though also available in Indian or in subcontinental or Pakistani accent. Zhao, pardon me. Though she loves Dinah, she considers her hopelessly, impractically a religious dreamer. Arthur and Mrs. Irwin arrives, and Mrs. Irwin talks to Dinah while Mrs. Poyser complains to Arthur about the condition of the farms. Arthur's grandfather, Squire Dunnythorne, is a stingy landlord and will not pay for improvements on his tenants' places. Arthur asked to see the diary, and Mrs. Poyser led him in Etty Sorrel, a distractingly pretty girl of 17 is making butter. Arthur had noticed her beauty before, and indeed had wanted to visit the dairy primarily to get an opportunity to talk with her. That's a point of their first meeting, and they are trying. He is trying to meet Hattie Sorrel. He flatters the girl, asking for two dances with her at the ball celebrating his coming of age. Hattie is overwhelmed by the rich gentleman's attention. Arthur, who is kind to all his tenants and is popular among them, gives a present to the child Toti, and then goes in search of Mr. Irwin. While Mr. Irwin has been discussing Dinah's preaching with her, he asked about her background. Dinah is from from a Blake Mill town called Snowfield. Blake Mill town called Snowfield. And about her vocation as a preacher, Dinah describes the first time she felt the call to preach, and Mrs. Irwin is favorably impressed with her sincerity. She says that all her life she has been led to help the poor, both materially and spiritually. Mr. Irwin then mentions that Adam Bede's father has died, and Dinah, touched with pity for the widow, decides to visit her and try to comfort her. At this point, Arthur emerges from the dairy with Mrs. Poyser, and Mrs. Irwin rises to leave. When the two men are going, Mrs. Poyser questions Dinah about the rector's reaction to her preaching and makes her eat something before setting out of the Bede's cottage. Hattie comes in, and Mrs. Poyser tells her of Theas Bede's death. Unlike Dinah, she is almost indifferent to it. Hattie returns to the dairy and indulges herself in a pleasant thought about Arthur, although she does not take Arthur's attention very seriously. She can't help losing herself in romantic dreams about the handsome, rich young squires. She knows that her aunt and uncle would like her to return the affection which Adam Bede has for her. But he strikes her as cutting and inconsequential figure. Besides the exciting Arthur, after describing Hattie's state of mind, the Arthur resumes her plot line. Arthur and Mrs. Irwin ride away from the farm, and Arthur indicates that he admires Hattie's beauty. Mr. Irwin warns him not to feed her vanity by paying attention to her. Arthur implies that he has no intention of doing so. अब इस सारे चैप्टर के now this the all chapter, in this all chapter you are going to discuss and you are going to understand from chapter number 6 to chapter number 9 the different parts and the different eras and the different levels of the incidents are available. Now we are going to discuss the commentary. Mrs. Poyser is always pointed out as one of the more successful comic character in modern English fiction, an extremely vital figure. She dominates in most of his scene in which she appears and constantly delights the reader with her with and energy with her wit and energy. Mrs. Poyser is a larger than life figure, more vivid and more colorful than most people or even most literary characters. She stands out, for example, even more clearly that than Adams does. Her role in the novel is similar. This quality derives partially from the fact that she is characterized more simply than Adam is. She possessed the clarity of figure drawn in bold outlines with the distracting details left out. But but her vividness derives equally, if not more, from her dramatic and highly individual style of speaking. Mrs. Poyser rarely discusses anything calmly. She deals in exaggeration and over simplification as a habit. For example, she informs Arthur that farming is putting money into your pocket. Why your right hand and fetching it out why your left. And she announced the Thias Bede's death to Hetty to sing, but Adam Bede and all his kin might to drowned for what you had care. Her most typical utterance are based upon similar drawn from nature and the domestic scene, and this imagery reinforce her characteristic exaggeration. As I say to Poyser, looking at Mr. Irwin is like looking at a full crop of wheat or pasture with a fine dairy. Oh, in it cows in it. It makes you think the words comfortable like, but as for such creatures as you methodizes run after, I'd as soon go to look at a lot of bare ribbed runs, for example, cattle on a common. Like Lisbeth, Mrs. Poyser functions to a great extent as background character. She plays no great part in the development of the plot, but she is nevertheless a very real figure, and the student interested in the creation of characters in fiction can learn a great deal by analyzing the mode changes, the sentiments, and especially the speech patterns of the redoubtable Mrs. Poyser. The pictures we get of Hetty in these chapters is paradoxically not a pretty one. Although she appears shy and sweet and pretty at the first, Eliot soon convinces us that Hetty is a self-centered and childish when the author accomplishes the author accomplishes this by reporting what goes on in Hattie's mind. Chapter 9 consists almost entirely of a description of the girl's past and present through on the subject of man and her own attractiveness. This device is used with great frequently and sometimes at great length in Adam Bede as a method of characterization. The omniscient point of view is used not only to describe the words and actions of characters, but the inner reality of their minds, their thoughts, modes, and emotional attitudes as well. As it appears from Hattie's thoughts in chapter number 9. In chapter number 9, that Adam will not be able to win her love as he hopes. She likes the idea of keeping Adams in the power, but feels no inclinations at all to marry him. Hattie tends to think of romance in terms of fine clothes and luxuries. She is definitely out for what she can get. As for Adam, she feels that she could have loved him well enough to marry him if he had been rich. The irony of the passage convinces us of Hattie's shallowness and serves to build suspense in the plot as the readers recognize that Adam has made a disastrous romantic choice. Because Hattie is no interested in material things. She is the perfect dupe for Arthur. He flatters her at this point mostly for the sake of being charming. When Mr. Irwin cautions him not to become too interested in Hattie, he replies that he has no use for such advice. He has not intention of becoming serious about her, but Hattie is already far gone in romantic dreams. She amuses herself by recalling and mulling over any kind gestures Arthur makes towards her. It is dangerous and amusement. The girl is so fascinated by Arthur's wealth and social position. He seems like an Olympian god to her. Then that she cannot help hoping that his interest in her will grow. The flirtation between Arthur and Hattie then begins innocently enough. That's an important point in this. Innocently enough, innocently enough, made it clear. The dashing young gentleman meets the lovely young farm girl and trifles with her. He is confident of his ability to control himself and never imagines that a situation will get out of hand. She, meanwhile, led on by foolish versions of grandeur, convinces herself 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 about herself that his attentions are serious. Both people, their attitudes, influences by vanity, blindly entangle themselves in a relationship which neither is equipped to control. Eliot carefully construct a plausible situation which almost by its very nature must lead to trouble for both parties involved. Chapter 8 deals with Mr. Irwin's conversation with Dinah. The reader should note that in this situation, as in various others throughout the novel, Hattie and Dinah are specifically contrasted. While Hattie is flirting with Arthur, Dinah is carrying on a serious religious discussion with the clergyman. Hattie's manners is flightly immature and worldly. Dinah's is grave, womanly, and spiritual. When Mrs. Irwin tells Dinah that Theas Bede is dead, he immediately reaction is one of pity for Lisbeth, and she offers without hesitation to go to the cottage and help the old woman. But when Mrs. Poyser gives Hattie the same news, she feigns concern but is not deeply affected. Dinah humanity and generosity seems even more laudable when played off so directly against Hattie's selfish indifferences. The author emphasizes this contrast even more strongly by giving each of the young woman a different sort of beauty. She emphasizes the difference by employing opposed patterns of imagery in describing the girls. Dinah's loveliness is frequently mentioned. He faces is sorry, her face is said to be likely a lily, and Lisbeth in several places compares her to an angel, but her beauty has a pure spiritual quality about it which make men not lustful but respectful. When Mr. Irwin asked Dinah if men bother her when she is preaching, she says that although she has spoken before some very hard and wild men, they have always treated her with kindness and civility. Hetty's beauty, on the other hand, is described as being soft and kittenish, like childish. She appeals to everyone, even other women. There is something very warm and inviting about Hattie's sort of prettiness, something healthy nature and earthy. Throughout the novel, George Eliot or GE toys with the contrast between the appearance and reality things. Appearance and reality things very often are not what they seem. The physical comparison of Dinah and Hattie marks the first major manifestations of the theme. Both girls appears beautiful, but only Dinah is so. Hattie's beauty is superficial. It masks a vain, selfish spirit, while Dinah's physical beauty truly reflects the beauty of her soul. The reader should be attentive to these appearances. Reality contrast in the novel, particularly with respect to Adam and Arthur and Hattie and Dinah. The contrast form one of the most significant pattern in the Adam Bede. So, dear students, today I've got from chapter number 6 to chapter number 9, and we have got the main idea of this particular lecture, and we have got some important points as a comment, as a commentary, and we have got all the chapter summaries till chapter number 9, and it was my third lecture and the third part of the lecture of Adam Bede. So I'm going to conclude it right now, and we are going to leave it, and we will discuss it in the next part 4, and we will thoroughly do it with the complete same commentary, with some important points, with some contrasting elements, with some important elements, with some delightful writer codes. I will definitely tell to you. I will definitely deliver to you. And now let me go now. And before going, I again request to you that you can also, if one of from your family, if a person is doing BS Urdu, my BS Urdu lectures are available at Murshid Urdu Professor MA Raza. That can be followed, that can be delivered to, that can be shared to that particular person. And must request to you again, the final request, that must subscribe and hit the bell icon. So let me go now and say with me, do something more for humanity, do something more for knowledge and practices. Have a good day.